Welcome everyone to Retro Wrestling Reviews. Fredo Esparza here again with another edition, and this time we'll be covering the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling episode from September 19th, 1981. You can find this episode available on the WWE Network in the Territories section under the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling logo. This show was taped at the WPCQ TV studios in Charlotte, North Carolina. Your hosts for this episode are Bob Caudle and David Crockett, which kind of tells you what's going on because Roddy Piper is usually the one on commentary for the most part. Whenever they would actually switch back and forth, because at some point later on, they would still have David Crockett on, but he wouldn't be on throughout the show. They would have specific wrestlers, but primarily Roddy Piper was the one that was the other host of the show. Ron Bass ends up joining them, and he joins to talk about the Wahoo McDaniel, Roddy Piper, Abdullah the Butcher situation. They recently, on a previous episode, they had actually started talking about an altercation where Roddy Piper brought in Abdullah the Butcher to attack Wahoo McDaniel and injure him. I think he injured him briefly, but didn't get him out of the wrestling like he had hoped for. And Ron Bass was there to talk about that briefly. He was there very briefly. That's then followed by a match pitting Ricky the Dragon Steamboat and Jay Youngblood versus Mike Miller and Rick Harris. For those not familiar with Rick Harris, you will later know him best as Black Bart. And here he's very young. I think at this point in time, he was splitting his time in various territories. I think he did a few matches in Mid-South Wrestling and then a few in Georgia Championship Wrestling. And here he is in Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. Ricky Steamboat ended up getting the pin on Mike Miller after a top rope flying body press. This was a competitive tag team match. It was okay, borderline good, just because Miller and Harris were very competitive. They were, that was the good thing about Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, that they had very good enhancement talent that could actually work. And they basically bumped a lot for Youngblood and Rick Steamboat, who were very good on offense. So Steamboat and Youngblood get the win in the first match of this episode. That is then followed by Sergeant Slaughter versus Ron Ritchie. There's actually going to be a match later on in early 1982, where Sergeant Slaughter absolutely just beats the living daylights out of Ron Ritchie in a match. But in this match, it's more of a squash, with Slaughter getting the win after he picks up Ron Ritchie and slams him into his belly first into his knee, and then he covers him for the pin. This was a short match, probably the shortest match on this episode. That is then followed by Jake Roberts versus Jim Nelson. This is Jim Nelson before he becomes a private with Sergeant Slaughter. And many of you probably know Jim Nelson best as Boris Zukov later on, but here he is as more of an enhancement talent facing Jake the Snake Roberts. Nelson at this point was already showing some potential as somebody that the Mid-Atlantic territory was going to start using a little more frequently and move him up a bit on the card. So he got more of a competitive match with Jake Roberts. During the match, Ole Anderson and Roddy Piper show up to show their support for Jim Nelson. You see Ole at one point give Nelson advice outside of the ring. Roddy Piper cheers him on. It really doesn't do anything for Nelson because Jake the Snake Roberts ends up getting him in a DDT. Oddly enough, the DDT is not Jake the Snake Roberts' finisher in this match, or even early in his career. His finisher and what he used as a finisher in this match was the knee lift, and he gets the win with Nelson. The knee lift was really popular at that point in time. I think it must have been because a lot of the guys were fans of Mr. Wrestling 2, and that was his finisher, the knee lift. So you see Roberts using it, and a few other guys use it in their matches, but they also used it as a finisher. But obviously, Mr. Wrestling 2 is probably the one that's best known for using the knee lift as his finisher. After this match, Ole and Roddy Piper climb up to the ring to confront Jake the Snake Roberts, but Ron Bass shows up to even up the sides. That leads to Piper and Ole backing away. They do not leave. They end up going for an interview with Bob Caudle, where they basically said that they did not go into the ring because they knew what would happen. They'd get fined or suspended by Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. Ole then ends up insulting Wahoo McDaniel and Ric Flair, while Roddy Piper gloats about how he and Abdullah the Butcher gave Wahoo McDaniel the beating of his life. Although that, like I said, that doesn't drive Wahoo McDaniel out of wrestling. He's briefly gone from the territory, but ends up coming back later on. Sergeant Slaughter follows them up for an interview, and he gets upset with Bob Caudle over the way he introduces him. He vows to win a major title within the territory, and then he gets upset again with Bob Caudle because Bob Caudle cuts him off to go to a commercial break. Slaughter did not like how he was cut off. Slaughter was really amusing in his interviews early on, kind of just like being a bully and a bit of a snob. But yeah, I think he had a bit of a sense of humor, so he was able to add a little more to a little more humor to his promos. After that, we get Ron Bass versus Charlie Fulton for the NWA World TV title. Ron Bass, the one defending the title. Bass ends up getting the win with a Stampede Power Slam. This was an okay match. Fulton was competitive in it. Really more of a Haas battle between these two with them being bigger guys. So you kind of had a little bit more of a back and forth, but mostly just an okay match. Not something that if you're watching wrestling nowadays, it's not something that you're really going to get very excited about. You get that with a lot of older matches where if it's it might drag a bit what they're doing because of the offense being mostly just, side headlocks, forearm smashes and elbows. There's a little bit more there's not as much variety in some of these matches. But this was an okay match. And then we get to the main event, which is Ole Anderson and Roddy Piper going up against Paul Jones and Frank Monty. Jones and Monty get a lot in this match, a lot of offense as they kind of try to get they always keep trying to fight back and get the edge on their heel opponents. So it turned out to be a good competitive match. Roddy Piper starts off prior to this match playing the bagpipes, which was funny because you have Caudle and Crockett asking Piper why he stopped playing, and then they start talking about how really the only person that wants to hear Roddy Piper play his bagpipes is actually Roddy Piper himself, not the fans. But like I said, the match was very competitive. Jones and Piper particularly were very going back and forth with their punches and their attacks. They end up having a wild brawl in the match. To close out, the closing minutes is pretty much just a wild brawl, and the referee is unable to regain order. He gets shoved by the heels a couple of times, and then he ends up disqualifying Piper and Anderson. Piper and Anderson continue their attack until Ron Bass and Ricky Steamboat run out to stop them from what they're doing. Post match, Ron Bass and Ricky Steamboat mentioned that they are tired of Piper and Anderson. Bass wants a Falls Count Anywhere match against either one. He also suggests that Wahoo get that type of match against Roddy Piper. Steamboat calls them cowards and says their end is coming. That's basically all that happens in this episode. Like I said, the main event was very competitive. The two tag matches were pretty good and competitive. The earlier one had the heel enhancement guys, Harris and Mike Miller, being more bump takers, bumping for Steamboat and Youngblood. And Steamboat and Youngblood, if you have not watched them as a tag team, they're a really good tag team, great tag team. Youngblood and Steamboat use a lot of chops, but they're also very fast, quick on their feet. So I thought that was a really good. That was a pretty good TV match. And then the main event was very more of a wild brawl that had the Jones Monte tag team getting a little more offense against the bigger heel team. The singles matches, like I said, Bass and Fulton was an okay match. Roberts and Nelson was pretty good. I thought was pretty good, just because again Nelson gets a little more offense. That's one of the good things. Like from watching, since I'll be recapping what I'm going to review at the moment. It's World Class Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling and Mid-South Wrestling. I'll start with those. Then as we finish these promotions, we'll go into other promotions. But I'll go with those three promotions first. And one of the things you'll notice with all three of the promotions is that they have, I think Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling had a little bit more of a competitive jobber group on their roster. World Class used a smaller roster, so they didn't really have a lot of enhancement talent. They had a few guys like Raul Castro and guys like that, but it was more of a select group of guys that was working certain periods of time in that territory. And Mid-South was very similar with Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. I think the big difference was that Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling goes through some periods where they might have a couple of TV episodes where they don't have the top stars available to them because their top stars are working everywhere, not just Mid-Atlantic, but they're working in Georgia. Like, for example, Ric Flair is traveling around the country at this point in time as, as not either as a champion or as a challenger. So he'll be all over the place, be it Georgia, World Class, Oregon, anywhere you'd see him all over the place. Japan, you'd even get like some of these guys end up in Japan. Steamboat was very much traveling to Japan by this point in time. So I think that's the big difference with Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, where you'll get a couple of episodes where they're a little bit down. Mid-South is a little more consistent. They have a few shows where there's a bit of a drop off, but not as much as Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. World Class, I think it varies depending on the Von Erichs, whether they're there or not there, because sometimes they'll have like a really Bugsy McGraw or Al Madrill type of. Al Madrill is pretty good at this point in time in World Class, but guys like Bugsy McGraw or some of the lesser athletic guys who were a part of the promotion at that point in time would get more featured, the heels basically, and they would get a lot of squash matches. So again, like I said, this episode of Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling was excellent. Really enjoyed it. Highly recommend you watch it if you have a chance. Like I said, Piper and Ole at this point in time are getting under everyone's skin. Throughout the show, they've got issues with Ricky Steamboat, Ron Bass, Wahoo McDaniel, Jake the Snake Roberts, Paul Jones. Everyone is kind of going after them. And then you have Sergeant Slaughter cutting a funny interview. Later on, they have Slaughter kind of become the focal point and be the guy who's kind of has all the issues. And, maybe the other guys will have like a specific person that they're feuding with. But, they vary from time to time. But you kind of see with Sergeant Slaughter how they're slowly building him into the top heel in the territory. I think by the end of the year, he's basically the main guy, the main heel in the territory, with everybody trying to get him. So, again, fun episode. Definitely watch it. Be sure to subscribe to the Retro Wrestling YouTube channel, and we'll have more wrestling show reviews as well as the Lucha World podcast and other content available, including every Saturday, Stan Hansen Saturday. A new episode every single Saturday. Also, be sure to visit the website retrowrestling.com for classic wrestling reviews. And for Lucha, visit my website luchaworld.com. For added content, you could check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/luchaworld. Thanks again, everyone. We'll talk to you guys again soon.